Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Whiskey Wednesdays. My name's Daryl M, and I'm your host. This week, instead of the regular whiskey tasting, many of you have reached out to me about doing a Whisky Appreciation 101. So this week for our tutorial, we're going to go through the way we review our whiskeys, covering the 5 core areas, as well as talking about some tasting tips along with whiskey, paraphernalia, and glasses that you see right behind me. Before we get started, would you do me a favor? Click the thumbs up button below, share this video, and subscribe to my channel. I need your help to get me to 1,000 subscribers by the end of this year. All it takes is for each of you to invite just 2 new subscribers and fans to my page. Just share that video and let's get people with eyes and views on my channel. Would you do that for me? If you're new to my channel, welcome. You can browse and watch all of my other whiskey reviews on here. I'm always open to your feedback so we can make this journey even better. What kind of a whiskey lover are you? Are you a whiskey lover who loves to drink or who loves to collect? I know I enjoy both, and I'm often purchasing 2 bottles of whiskey, one to drink and the other one to add as a collection. Ultimately, the love of whiskey is not a cheap hobby. It is, in fact, relatively expensive and mainly for the affluent or the wealthy. However, it doesn't mean it's not accessible to everyone. As a whiskey lover and collector, I have tasted a diverse selection of whiskeys and count over 100 bottles in my collection, from a $65 bottle of whiskey right up to a $1,000 bottle of whiskey. Yet, I have met other collectors across the world on my travels that have collections in excess of 5, 6, and 7 figures. So in comparison, my collection is rather modest. The premium price reflects the quality of each dram. And in my opinion, a premium whiskey is a worthy addition to any whiskey collector's cabinet or collection. That being said, a $600 bottle of whiskey doesn't always mean it's better. It's really up to each individual and how the scents and flavors appeal to each person that really matters. This video for Whisky Appreciation 101, I'm going to share with you some of the tasting tips that will help you enjoy every single whiskey you come across and taste. Regardless of the price, it's all about how you react and how the whiskey reacts and interacts with you, and how you're going to be able to enjoy them. You may have heard me use the following terminologies and definitions in my whiskey videos. Some of them are interchangeable and mean the same thing. However, there are times that just one letter could make a world of a difference. Here are a few examples. Whiskey without the E versus whiskey with the E. What's the difference between the two? Well, whiskey without the E, as you see on my channel, Whisky Wednesdays, refers primarily to Canadian, Scottish, and Japanese grain whiskies, whereas whiskey with the E are for whiskies distilled in Ireland and the United States. Scotch versus whiskey. Well, let's put it this way. All Scotches are whiskies, but not all whiskies are Scotches. Does that make sense to you? In order for a whiskey to be called a Scotch, it must be distilled in Scotland, hence the word Scotch. Single malt versus blended whiskey. What's the difference between a single malt whiskey and a blended whiskey? Well, a single malt whiskey refers to a whiskey that is produced by a single distillery using pot stills and only malted barley. While single malts are most famous among Scotch whiskies, others include the Kavalan Distillery from Taiwan that produces some amazing single malts. You also have single grain whiskies, and that again very similar but only using grain. Blended whiskey could mean one of the following combinations. A blended malt comprised of combining single malts from various distilleries, or a blended grain whiskey comprised of combining single grains from various distilleries, or a blended whiskey comprised of combining malt and grain whiskeys. For example, the Johnnie Walker Blue Label Legendary 8, which I have in my collection, is a blended malt whiskey which comprises of combining single malts from the top 8 Scottish distilleries, producing an ultra smooth texture and incredible taste. Neat versus on the rocks. What's the difference? Well, neat means you're drinking whiskey straight up in a glass, no ice. And on the rocks means that you're adding ice, or more commonly today, rocks. And we'll discuss that a little bit later on, the difference between adding ice cubes or rocks to your whiskey. A dram versus a nip. Well, a dram, the actual measurement is 1/6 of an ounce of whiskey. A dram is typically what gets served in when you're ordering it outside of the bar, and that gets served to you in a single shot. So that's 1 dram. A nip, it could be used interchangeably with a dram. However, most of the time today in a Scottish environment, you're looking at a nip being half of a dram. So for example, if you watch that video that we did the tour of at the Dam Pub over in Collingwood, they actually serve flights by the nips, which is half of a dram. And that's just how I could have 6 flights of whiskey for lunch and not keel over. ABV. You'll hear me say this a lot, and ABV stands for alcohol by volume. It's calculated as a percentage of the alcohol inside the whiskey, and you'll see that as a percentage marked on every single bottle of whiskey. Did you know that as the alcohol content increases, the taxes also increase? Hence why you have cask strength whiskeys that are more expensive to purchase, because they get taxed more by the country of origin where they're distilled. And of course, we have cask strength. The difference between a cask strength whiskey and a regular whiskey is that most regular whiskeys are diluted. You would have heard me say in some of the videos where, what kind of water is used in the distilling process. So the most recent video there from Glenlivet as well as Aberfeldy, they have pure aquifers, or they have natural spring water, and that actually makes a difference to the flavor of the whiskey. However, a cask strength whiskey means that it is not diluted. What you're getting directly from the barrel goes straight into the bottle, which makes the alcohol concentration higher, and therefore, like I mentioned in the last point, it is taxed at a higher rate, and therefore it's considered more premium and the strength is much higher. You'll remember one of my previous videos where a group of us purchased a barrel from the North of Seven distillery right here in the Ottawa area, and the bottle that I have is 74.5%. That is a cask strength whiskey. I taste oakwood. He tastes sawdust. Who's right? Well, remember that everyone's nose and taste buds are different. So you may smell or taste something different from the person next to you. What's also important to remember in whiskey appreciation is that every person's life and cultural experience matters and gets factored into your experience and how your taste buds and your scent is developed. To give you an example, I've mentioned the word and the taste of nutmeg quite a number of times through my whiskey reviews. Not many people in North America would recognize the taste or the smell of a nutmeg. However, having grown up in Asia and enjoying this as a snack as well as a spice in my foods, that flavor often rings a bell for many of the spicier whiskeys that I'm tasting. So right now, I'd like to go over some of the whiskey paraphernalia. You'll see some of these glasses and containers behind me. We'll go over each of them. There is, as there are a variety of ways to taste whiskey and a huge variety and a selection of whiskeys out there, there are also going to be different glasses and containers that you can use to help you appreciate the flavor and tastes and smells of whiskey. This is a shot glass. Generally, a no-no for me. Single malts, in my opinion, are a gentleman's drink and meant to be enjoyed and sipped on slowly and savored. Knocking back a dram of whiskey in a shot glass, in my opinion, is crass, amateurish, and a waste of good whiskey. This is the Glencairn glass, or the Glencairn nosing glass. And you'll see in many of my whiskey videos that this is my preferred go-to instrument to taste and to review and to enjoy whiskey. And the reason for that is the nosing glass you'll see has a wide bottom and a narrow top. So it allows the whiskey to breathe, but it also allows you to put your nose in the center to be able to inhale the scent of the whiskey. Very similar to a red wine glass, this allows you also to roll the whiskey where you get to see how long the legs are. And those legs enable you to see whether or not the texture is oily, and it helps you, it gives you an idea at least on the finish. Now the finish will be a taste unto itself towards the end of each whiskey review. However, just being able to see and roll that whiskey around, the Glencairn glass is probably one of the best. And as a little tip, the Glencairn glass was actually the first whiskey tasting glass that was wholly endorsed by the Scottish Whisky Association. And this glass here, very straight up, it's known as the old-fashioned glass. The old-fashioned glass is great for mixed drinks, where you're putting in there with an ice cube or mixing that with, let's say, a Coke, or you're drinking a whiskey sour. As a rule of thumb, the old-fashioned glass is a good sipping glass, but you're not typically going through the whole connoisseur process of smelling the whiskey. You're just there to enjoy the whiskey. And like I said, when you're mixing that with other drinks or putting ice cubes in it, having a much larger bottom and an equal size just makes things easier. And this is a whiskey tumbler or whiskey flask. It's very common. You see it's very flat, and it typically comes in a metal container, small enough that fits into a sporran. A sporran is the pouch that you wear in front of a kilt. And for me, for someone who's very involved in the Highland world, every time you see me in a kilt, you can bet that I have one of these whiskey flasks filled with my secret, call it my secret juice, that I'll carry with me on the field in the Highland Games. And next we will talk about chilled rocks and ice cubes. So ice cubes, very commonly known as if you're going to have a scotch on the rocks, which means you're having a scotch whiskey on ice. Now, that was the old way of saying it, scotch on the rocks. Today, there are all these different inventions that help you enjoy a chilled whiskey without diluting the content of the whiskey too much. So here we have a whiskey rocks option. And these are like little stones that you can put in the freezer and get them chilled. I'll show you one of these. The great thing about these whiskey rocks is you can get them chilled, so you have a nice chilled whiskey. However, you can let them chill in your glass for an extended period of time to still allow you to sip the whiskey without the condensation from it diluting or overly diluting your whiskey. Whereas an ice cube, if you're sipping that, let's say on a summer day, within 10 minutes, you're going to have most of that ice cube melt into your drink. And it becomes one of those where you're having, 1 part whiskey and 6 parts water. And that's where it comes to the point where it's almost a waste of a good dram. So if you like your whiskey chilled, then my suggestion and advice is to invest in whiskey rocks, because the rocks will enable you to enjoy a chilled whiskey without it diluting your whiskey and changing its flavor. And speaking of water and diluting your whiskeys, as a rule, I've been to whiskey tastings where people are either putting their drams under a tap and turning on the tap. However lightly you turn on the tap, that just means it's too much water going into your whiskey. So what I would often recommend is you invest in one of these. I call these a little dripper. Remember those science experiments in chemistry class in school? You can invest in one of these. Now, prior to using this, I used to joke with my friends that I had nothing more than a turkey baster. That was this massive one that would still allow you to drip water in small quantities at a time. But this is an excellent way for you to get water into this little droplet, and then you'll be able to control the amount of drops that go into your dram. So if you want to add some water to dilute your dram, for example, if you're drinking a cask strength whiskey, try it neat first, and then try that adding with 1, 2, maybe 3 drops of water, but not more than that. And you'll find that by adding 2 or 3 drops of water, it would change the flavor, it changed the actual texture and the concentration of the whiskey, and that in itself may emit and produce different flavors and scents for you. So a great investment tool to have. And as for most of my whiskey tastings that I hold here in my home, I always have a empty Glencairn or old-fashioned glass of chill filtered water with a little droplet. So that way my guests will be able to dilute their whiskeys without drowning their drams with water. I like to divide my whiskey reviews into 5 core areas: color, nose, palate, finish, and pairing. The majority of whiskey reviewers out there generally only have the 4 areas. No one really includes the pairing. Pairing is something that I have actually introduced to all of my videos just to provide my audience with an opportunity to try different pairings of food, snacks, or even cigars with the whiskey. And I think that adds an extra element to the appreciation of whiskey as an overall subject. So, first and foremost, the color. So right here we've got a single malt and Aberlour 12-year-old. And you'll see here, when you're looking at the color, I like to put that against the light so you can actually see whether or not it is, what kind of a color. The shade is important. That's one thing you want to note. You also want to see whether or not the whiskey itself, can you see through it? Is it clear or is it thicker as a liquid? And that would tell you in terms of the purity of that whiskey. And remember what I mentioned before is that with your Glencairn glasses, when you roll that whiskey around, almost like a red wine, now you can see those legs as they're coming down. Do they take a while to drip down the side? And if they do, it may indicate that it's more oily as a texture. And then you can compare that with the finish at the end. Now, there are going to be 2 separate approaches that I want to share with you when you're doing the nosing aspect for the whiskey. So the first is to inhale with your nose and exhale with your mouth, like so. You'll see that when I'm doing that, I move the glass away just so that I'm not exhaling accidentally through my nose and causing any condensation going back into the glass. And the second way is to position your nose in the center of this nosing glass and to both inhale and exhale with your mouth. And when you're doing that, to be able to taste the scent or as it's coming through your nose, like so. Try that with the whiskeys that you're tasting. Do you notice a slightly different scent? Remember that in each instance, you want to avoid exhaling through your nose and getting any kind of condensation back in the glass. Do you notice different scents? Is it spicy? Is it floral? Does it remind you of a certain scent? And the great thing about whiskey appreciation, like I mentioned before, is every person is going to sense something different. And your idea of a scent could be floral, could be spicy. You could have things like it smells like campfire or it smells like sawdust. It's going to be based on your experience. There's no right or wrong answer. So be creative and let your senses guide you. And for the palate, again, there are 2 ways which I enjoy tasting my whiskeys. The first is what I call the short taste. Now, the short taste versus the long taste. The short taste for me is when you're taking that sip, immediately swallowing that whiskey as opposed to letting it linger in your mouth. For the short taste, take a small sip, and swallow it. Now, before swallowing, what you're going to do is take a small breath, and then after you've done the swallow, you're going to then breathe out while tasting on your taste buds, like so. And that gives you one way to taste it. So let's do that together. Now make a mental note of what you tasted, or you can write that down if you forget easily, like me. And for the second way, we're going to, I call it the long taste. So the difference between the short taste and the long taste is the long taste, you're going to let the whiskey coat your palate and linger your mouth for about, I'd say, 15 to 20 or even 30 seconds if you prefer. The important thing is that you're going to let the whiskey, it's almost like you're gargling it or having it go through your mouth, coat everything, and then you're going to sense a few things that are different. One, you're going to see if it burns your lips, and if so, how long does it burn for? And you're also going to see if there's any spiciness. Sometimes you sense the tingling on your palate. So make mental notes of all of those and see how it differs from the first tasting. Let's try that together. Now, when you're trying that with your whiskeys at home, do you notice a slightly different flavor because it has lingered on your palate longer? In each instance, you'll notice that I actually close my eyes when I'm swallowing, and I find that it's an easier way for me to visualize what the flavor translates to. And again, like I said, based on your experience, I could then visualize nutmeg, cinnamon, sometimes it's star anise, and it allows me to then identify those flavors in my whiskey. And now for the finish. So we just completed the palate. Now the palate and the finish, many people combine them together because it's all about tasting, and that long taste that we just did allows us to also experience how long the whiskey lingers. What's important about the finish is identifying whether or not the whiskey dissipates really quickly from your palate, or perhaps it's more floral, or if it's a medium finish. So the three kind of finishes that I generally use to identify in my whiskey reviews are the short finish, where the whiskey dissipates really quickly in taste, the medium finish, where the whiskey lingers for a short period, and of course, the long finish. The long finish generally for the richer whiskeys, and the long finish ensures that the whiskey lingers and the spiciness that you taste would dance off your palate for probably another minute or so after you have even swallowed the whiskey. What's also interesting about whiskeys with a long finish is that at times you may actually taste a slightly varying flavor after about a minute or so that the whiskey has been swallowed, and yet the remnants of the whiskey on your palate actually produces a different taste. So try that next time with a whiskey that has a long finish. What's also typical of whiskeys with long finishes is that it would also emit different and varying flavors, such as spiciness, nuttiness, perhaps oakiness. Again, descriptions there are no standard descriptions. It's really about how you taste based on your experience, based on your palate, based on your senses. So be very open to it. The important thing in any whiskey tasting that I'm hosting, either in person or virtually, is I tell people there is no right or wrong answer. That whiskey appreciation is all about how you appreciate whiskey. When I share through my whiskey reviews, it's all about how I am interpreting the taste or the scent of that whiskey. So go out there and enjoy your whiskeys. For the fifth tasting area, or the fifth core review area, we have the pairing. Reviews online and most whiskey reviewers stick to the four core areas: color, nose, palate, and finish. By putting in this fifth area known as the pairing, what I've tried to do for my viewing audience is to connect the different kinds of foods out there and be experimental with the flavors that can help complement the whiskeys that you are tasting. Through the course of my review, using the fifth pairing option method, it has become somewhat of a highlight for many of my fans. I've received quite a number of comments, both public as well as private ones, saying that they actually look forward to what they can pair this whiskey to, because it's something that is not often talked about, and every person's experience and preferences will matter in terms of the kind of food and snacks that they're pairing with the whiskey. For example, recently I did a whiskey review on the Balvenie 14-year-old Caribbean cask, and because of the sweetness, I found that pairing it with dark chocolate with the sea salt in the dark chocolate actually gave a balance to the sweet whiskey. So the Balvenie 14-year-old Caribbean rum cask was actually a great pairing to dark chocolate with sea salt. For another example I did is to pair a whiskey with dried apricots and dried mangoes. I actually have a personal penchant favorite for dried mangoes. It's something I grew up with a lot in Asia. And I find that the tropical sweetness of those fruit, when you're pairing that with another sweeter whiskey, brings out those flavors more as well, and enhances that. So something for you to consider would be like the Dalwhinnie 15-year-old would be a great pairing with dried apricots and dried mangoes. Generally, you can procure whiskey in one of three ways: directly from the distillery, 2 from your local liquor store, 3 would be from a wholesaler or a specialty liquor store. Whiskeys that are marked travel retail exclusive means that they're only available at duty-free shops. And as a rule of thumb, they are available for people crossing international borders. As a globetrotter and frequent flyer, I've always kept an eye out for these whiskeys because they are definitely rare finds and they're not available in your local marketplace. I currently have 3 such premium whiskeys in my collection. The Aberfeldy 21-year-old Madeira cask, it's a travel exclusive. Right here we have the Johnnie Walker Blue Year of the Rat Special Edition that I purchased in 2019. And over here we have the Dalmore Luceo Travel Exclusive. Now the Johnnie Walker, what's interesting is Johnnie Walker Blue actually produces a year of the zodiac animal. It follows the Chinese zodiac, and my personal goal is to collect one of their whiskeys from each Chinese zodiac year, comprising altogether 12 of the animals. And like I said before, I'll have to purchase 2 bottles, 1 to drink and 1 to collect. And my goal is to be able to achieve that over the course of the next dozen years. So if you know where to purchase them, do let me know. We have come to the end of this week's whiskey video. Drop me a comment below if you enjoyed this Whisky Appreciation 101 tutorial. And don't forget to like and share this video with your friends and fellow whiskey lovers. Join me next time as I showcase a series of videos, interviews, and tastings from my private tour of the Shelter Point Distillery in Campbell River, British Columbia. And you'll see behind me the 5 bottles of whiskeys that arrived from Shelter Point in the mail this week. Until then, and wishing each of you a wonderful summer, sláinte.